Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the most incredible stories of human survival and resilience. Tonight, we're stepping into a world so harsh, so unforgiving, that it makes our worst winter days feel like a tropical vacation. We're talking about the Ice Age, a time when massive glaciers stretched across continents, when temperatures plummeted to deadly lows, and when our early ancestors faced what might have been humanity's greatest test of survival. Picture this for a moment. You wake up in a world where ice sheets tower over the landscape like frozen mountains, stretching as far as the eye can see. The air bites at your skin with a cold so intense it feels like needles. There are no grocery stores, no heated homes, no modern conveniences. Just you, your small group of fellow humans, and an environment that seems determined to freeze you out of existence. This was reality for our ancestors, roughly 20,000 years ago, during what scientists call the last glacial maximum. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this story. Not only did early humans survive this frozen nightmare, they actually thrived in it. They didn't just barely scrape by, they developed innovations, formed complex societies, and laid the groundwork for everything that would come after. The question that keeps researchers awake at night is simple yet profound. How did they do it? Before we dive into the incredible survival strategies that kept humanity alive during Earth's most challenging period, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready to discover something that will completely change how you think about human resilience. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the temperature is like where you are right now. I find it fascinating to think about how we're all connected across different climates and time zones, discussing ancestors who faced conditions most of us can barely imagine. Now, settle in. Maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to journey back to a time when survival wasn't guaranteed, when every day was a battle against the elements, and when human ingenuity was quite literally a matter of life and death. The story begins around 2.5 million years ago, but the chapter we're most concerned with takes place during the Pleistocene epoch, specifically during the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. This wasn't just a particularly cold winter that lasted a few months. We're talking about a period when massive ice sheets, some over a mile thick, covered huge portions of what we now know as Europe, North America, and Northern Asia. Imagine glaciers so vast they could swallow entire modern countries. These weren't just frozen rivers or lakes. These were continent-spanning walls of ice that fundamentally reshaped the geography of the planet. Sea levels dropped dramatically as all that water got locked up in ice, exposing land bridges between continents that are now separated by oceans. The Bering Land Bridge, which connected Siberia to Alaska, became a highway for both animals and humans, allowing our ancestors to spread into entirely new territories. The climate during this time was absolutely brutal. We're not talking about the kind of cold where you need an extra sweater. In many regions, temperatures were so low that even during summer months, the ground remained frozen. The landscape in the northern hemisphere was dominated by tundra, those vast treeless plains where only the hardiest plants could survive. Forests retreated to small pockets of relatively warmer areas, leaving behind barren expanses of ice and snow. But here's where the story gets interesting. Early humans were already pretty well adapted to different environments before the Ice Age hit full force. They'd spread across Africa and into parts of Asia and Europe, learning to hunt, gather, and build shelters in various climates. But the sheer scale and intensity of the Ice Age presented challenges unlike anything they'd faced before. The environmental changes weren't uniform across the globe, which is crucial to understanding how different groups of early humans survived. While Northern Europe and Asia were locked under massive ice sheets, other regions experienced different but equally challenging conditions. Some areas became vast deserts as the changing climate patterns disrupted rainfall. Others turned into cold, windswept steppes where only certain types of animals could thrive. What makes this period so fascinating from a survival perspective is that it wasn't just about enduring the cold. The Ice Age fundamentally altered the entire food web. Many plant species that early humans had relied on either died out or retreated to small refuges in warmer areas. The animals they hunted either adapted to the new conditions, migrated to different regions, or went extinct entirely. Take the mammoth, for instance. These massive, woolly creatures became perfectly adapted to the Ice Age environment. They developed thick coats of fur, layers of fat for insulation, and specialized trunks that could clear snow to reach vegetation underneath. For early humans, mammoths represented both an enormous opportunity and a terrifying challenge. A single mammoth could provide enough meat to feed a group for weeks, plus hide for clothing and bones for tools and shelter construction. But bringing down an animal that could weigh up to 6 tons required cooperation, planning, and courage on a scale that pushed human social organization to new levels. The psychological impact of living in such an environment is something we can barely comprehend today. Imagine months of near-total darkness in the far north, howling winds that could literally knock you off your feet, and the constant awareness that a single mistake, a moment of carelessness, could mean death for you and your entire group. The stress of finding food in a landscape where edible plants were scarce would have been overwhelming. Yet somehow, not only did early humans endure these conditions, they found ways to turn the challenges into opportunities. The harsh environment that threatened to destroy them also forced them to innovate in ways that would fundamentally change the trajectory of human development. They had to become better tool makers, more sophisticated hunters, and more cooperative as social groups. The Ice Age wasn't a single, unchanging period of cold. It was characterized by cycles of glacial and interglacial periods, times when the ice advanced and retreated. These cycles created additional challenges for early human populations, as they had to constantly adapt to changing conditions. Just when a group might have figured out how to survive in one environment, the climate would shift, forcing them to develop new strategies or migrate to different areas. During the coldest periods, survival often meant following the edges of the ice sheets, staying in areas that were cold but not completely frozen over. These marginal zones, while still incredibly harsh by our standards, provided just enough resources to support small human populations. Early humans became experts at reading the subtle signs that indicated where they might find food, water, and materials for shelter. The social implications of Ice Age survival were enormous. In such a challenging environment, every member of a group had to contribute to the collective survival effort. Children learned essential skills from a very young age, not because of any formal education system, but because their lives depended on it. Elderly members of the group weren't burdens, they were invaluable repositories of knowledge about weather patterns, animal behavior, and survival techniques. Knowledge transmission became more critical than ever during this period. A single piece of information about where to find food during the harshest months, or how to predict changes in weather patterns, could mean the difference between life and death for an entire group. This pressure to preserve and pass on knowledge likely accelerated the development of more sophisticated forms of communication, and may have played a crucial role in the evolution of human language. The Ice Age also created unique opportunities for human migration and expansion. As sea levels dropped and land bridges appeared, early humans could travel to places that had previously been inaccessible. The same environmental pressures that made survival difficult in some areas opened up entirely new territories in others. Groups that successfully adapted to Ice Age conditions found themselves able to spread across vast distances, eventually populating continents that had never seen human footprints before. What's particularly remarkable is that different groups of early humans, separated by vast distances and facing different environmental challenges, independently developed similar solutions to the problems posed by the Ice Age. Whether we're talking about groups in Europe learning to hunt mammoth, or populations in Asia developing techniques for surviving in frozen steppes, we see similar innovations emerging. the use of fire for warmth and cooking, the development of specialized tools for hunting large game, and the creation of sophisticated shelters that could withstand extreme weather. This convergent evolution of survival strategies suggests that the human response to the Ice Age wasn't just a matter of luck or coincidence. Our ancestors possessed the cognitive flexibility and innovative capacity to not just react to environmental challenges, but to actively problem solve and develop new technologies and social structures that gave them an advantage over other species facing the same harsh conditions. The story of Ice Age survival is ultimately a story about human adaptability and resilience. It's about small groups of people facing seemingly impossible odds, and not just surviving, but thriving well enough to ensure that their descendants, eventually us, would inherit a planet. In the coming parts of this series, we'll explore exactly how they did it. From the ingenious tools they created to the complex social structures they developed, and the incredible journeys they undertook across frozen continents in search of a better tomorrow. But surviving the Ice Age wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about reinventing what it meant to be human. And nowhere is this more evident than in how our ancestors completely revolutionized their relationship with fire. Before the Ice Age, fire was useful. During the Ice Age, fire became absolutely essential for survival. But mastering fire during this period wasn't the same as lighting a campfire on a pleasant summer evening. We're talking about maintaining flames in howling winds, keeping embers alive through months of snow and ice, and learning to create fire from scratch when your life literally depended on it. Think about the technical challenges for a moment. You're in an environment where temperatures can drop to -40 degrees. Your fingers are numb, your materials are frozen, and you need to create enough heat not just to warm yourself, but to cook food that might be frozen solid, to dry wet clothing that could give you hypothermia, and to create a psychological beacon of warmth and safety in a world that feels actively hostile to human life. Early humans during this period didn't just learn to make fire, they became fire engineers. They discovered which types of wood burned hottest and longest in extreme cold. They figured out how to bank fires so they could keep coals alive through the night without wasting precious fuel. Most importantly, they learned to carry fire with them as they traveled, developing portable fire-keeping techniques that allowed them to bring warmth and cooking capability wherever they went. The psychological importance of fire during the Ice Age cannot be overstated. In a world where darkness could last for months, and where the cold was a constant gnawing presence, fire represented more than just warmth. It was hope. It was the difference between feeling like a victim of the environment and feeling like you had some measure of control over your fate. But fire also transformed early human society in ways that are still visible today. Gathering around a fire became the center of social life. It was where stories were told, where knowledge was shared, and where the bonds that held groups together were strengthened. The hearth became the heart of human community, and this pattern, this fundamental human tendency to gather around sources of warmth and light, is something we still do today. Fire also revolutionized food preparation during the Ice Age. Cooking meat wasn't just about making it taste better. It was about extracting maximum nutrition from every scrap of food. In an environment where calories were precious and every bit of energy mattered, the ability to cook food meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Cooked meat was easier to digest, which meant early humans could extract more energy from their food while expending less energy in the digestive process. The mastery of fire also opened up new possibilities for food storage and preservation. Early humans learned to smoke meat over fires, creating jerky that could last for months without spoiling. This was crucial during the Ice Age, when successful hunts might be separated by long periods of scarcity. The ability to preserve food meant that a single successful mammoth hunt could sustain a group through weeks or even months of harsh weather. Fire became a tool for hunting as well. Early humans learned to use controlled fires to drive animals into traps or toward waiting hunters. They used torches to extend their hunting time into the dark months, and they used fire to process the materials they needed for other tools and weapons. The relationship between humans and fire during the Ice Age was so intimate and essential that it fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. But perhaps most importantly, fire gave early humans the ability to extend their range into environments that would have been completely uninhabitable without it. With fire, they could survive in caves, in temporary shelters, and even in the open air during the harshest weather. Fire allowed them to push into territories that no other primate had ever been able to inhabit. The social implications of fire mastery were enormous. Those who could reliably create and maintain fire became invaluable members of their groups. Firekeeping became a specialized skill, and with specialization came the beginnings of more complex social hierarchies. Some researchers believe that the critical importance of fire during the Ice Age may have been one of the driving forces behind the development of more sophisticated forms of human cooperation and social organization. Fire also played a crucial role in early human migration patterns during the Ice Age. Groups that had mastered fire could travel further and survive in harsher conditions than those who hadn't. This gave them access to new hunting grounds, new resources, and new territories. The mastery of fire was, in many ways, the technology that allowed early humans to become a truly global species. The techniques for firemaking that were developed during the Ice Age were incredibly sophisticated. Early humans learned to create fire using friction methods that worked even in cold, damp conditions. They developed tinder made from specially prepared plant materials that could catch fire even when everything else was wet. They learned to protect their fire-making materials from moisture and cold, carrying them in specially designed containers made from animal hides or carved from bone. But fire wasn't just a practical tool during the Ice Age. It also became deeply embedded in early human culture and spirituality. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans treated fire with a reverence that went beyond its practical applications. Fire became associated with life, warmth, protection, and community. The rituals and customs that grew up around fire during this period would influence human culture for thousands of years to come. The control of fire also had profound effects on early human physiology and development. The ability to cook food meant that early humans didn't need to spend as much energy on digestion, freeing up resources that could be used for brain development. Some researchers argue that the mastery of fire during the Ice Age was one of the key factors that allowed early humans to develop larger, more complex brains. Fire also changed the daily rhythms of early human life. Before fire, human activity was largely limited to daylight hours. With fire, early humans could extend their active time well into the night. This had enormous implications for social interaction, tool-making, and other activities that required manual dexterity and coordination. The ability to work and socialize after dark gave early human groups more time to develop the skills and relationships that were essential for survival. The mastery of fire during the Ice Age represents one of humanity's greatest technological achievements. It was a breakthrough that allowed our ancestors not just to survive in impossible conditions, but to thrive and expand into new territories. The skills and knowledge they developed around fire during this period became the foundation for countless future innovations, from metallurgy to cooking to the Industrial Revolution. As we'll see in the next part of our journey through Ice Age survival, the mastery of fire was just one of many incredible adaptations that allowed early humans to not just endure the harshest period in recent Earth history, but to emerge from it stronger, more innovative, and more capable than ever before. The story of fire is really the story of human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds, and it set the stage for even more remarkable innovations in hunting, shelter building, and social organization that we'll explore next. But mastering fire was only the beginning. As early humans pushed deeper into Ice Age territories, they encountered animals unlike anything we see today. These weren't just bigger versions of modern creatures. These were evolutionary marvels, perfectly adapted to a world of ice and snow, and hunting them required a complete revolution in human strategy and cooperation. Picture a mammoth for a moment. Not the cartoon version you might imagine, but the real thing. 13 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing as much as 4 modern cars, covered in a thick coat of rusty brown fur that could be 3 feet long in places, curved tusks that could span 14 feet from tip to tip, powerful enough to uproot entire trees, and underneath all that fur and bulk, a brain that was surprisingly intelligent and social. These creatures weren't just wandering around waiting to be dinner. They lived in complex family groups, communicated with each other through low-frequency calls that could travel for miles, and had learned over thousands of generations how to survive in the harshest environments on Earth. When early humans looked at a mammoth herd, they weren't seeing easy prey. They were seeing one of the most formidable challenges in the natural world. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about our ancestors. Instead of being intimidated by these massive creatures, they saw opportunity. A single adult mammoth could provide over 2 tons of meat, enough to feed a group of 30 people for more than a month. The fat alone could fuel fires and provide essential calories through the longest, coldest nights. The hide could be turned into clothing and shelter materials that were virtually waterproof and incredibly insulating. Even the bones became tools, weapons, and building materials. The challenge was obvious. How do you bring down an animal that could crush you with a single step, that traveled in protective herds, and that had evolutionary advantages built up over millions of years of surviving in frozen landscapes? The answer lay in something that would fundamentally change human society forever. Cooperation on a scale and level of sophistication that had never existed before. Early humans developed hunting strategies that required dozens of people working together with precise timing and coordination. They learned to study mammoth behavior for weeks, identifying the weakest members of the herd, understanding their movement patterns, and waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. This wasn't opportunistic hunting. This was strategic warfare against some of the most dangerous animals that ever lived. One of the most ingenious techniques involved using the landscape itself as a weapon. Early humans would identify natural traps, places where mammoths might get stuck or cornered. They'd drive entire herds toward cliff edges, using fire and coordinated shouting to create panic and confusion. The goal wasn't to kill through the fall, but to injure and isolate animals that could then be finished off by hunters with spears. But perhaps the most sophisticated hunting technique was the pit trap system. Groups of early humans would spend weeks digging enormous pits along known mammoth migration routes, covering them with branches and snow so they were invisible from above. When a mammoth stepped through and fell into the pit, it would be trapped, but not necessarily dead, allowing hunters to finish it off safely from above. These hunting strategies required tools that were far more advanced than anything humans had created before. The simple wooden spears that might work for hunting deer were useless against mammoth hide. Early humans had to develop composite weapons, spears with stone or bone points that were hafted with incredible precision, designed to penetrate thick fur and tough skin. They created spear throwers, devices that worked like extensions of the human arm, allowing hunters to launch spears with much greater force and accuracy than would be possible by hand alone. These weren't crude tools thrown together in desperation. Archaeological evidence shows that Ice Age spear throwers were engineered with the same attention to detail and functionality that we might put into designing a modern rifle. The social implications of mammoth hunting were staggering. Success required not just physical courage, but planning abilities that stretched across weeks or even months. Someone had to scout the herds, tracking their movements and identifying opportunities. Others had to prepare the tools and weapons, a process that could take days of careful crafting. Still others had to coordinate the actual hunt, directing dozens of people in a complex, dangerous operation where a single mistake could mean death for multiple hunters. This level of coordination required communication skills that pushed the boundaries of early human language. Hunters had to be able to discuss complex strategies, assign roles and responsibilities, and adapt their plans in real time as conditions changed. The cognitive demands of mammoth hunting may have been one of the driving forces behind the rapid development of human intelligence during this period. But mammoth hunting also created new social structures within early human groups. Success in hunting such dangerous prey required specialized skills and knowledge that not everyone possessed. Those who excelled at tracking, tool-making, or hunt coordination became leaders and decision-makers in ways that hadn't existed in earlier, simpler societies. The rewards of successful mammoth hunting went beyond just food and materials. Groups that could consistently bring down these massive animals gained status and resources that allowed them to thrive while others struggled. They could support larger populations, maintain better fed and healthier children, and accumulate the surplus resources needed to invest in even better tools and techniques. Mammoth hunting also changed the relationship between early humans and their environment. Instead of simply adapting to the conditions they found, they began actively shaping those conditions to their advantage. They learned to influence animal behavior, to modify landscapes for hunting purposes, and to think strategically about resource management on a scale that extended across seasons and years. The processing of a mammoth kill was itself a massive undertaking that required the entire group to work together for days or even weeks. Every part of the animal had to be used efficiently. The meat had to be carved, distributed, and preserved. The hide had to be cleaned, treated, and turned into useful materials. The bones had to be sorted and shaped into tools, weapons, and construction materials. Even the hair was valuable, used for insulation and cordage. This intensive processing work created opportunities for knowledge sharing and skill development that hadn't existed before. Children learned by watching and participating in every step of the process. Adults shared techniques and innovations that improved efficiency and results. The mammoth kill site became a temporary school where practical skills, social cooperation, and cultural knowledge were transmitted from one generation to the next. But mammoth hunting also came with enormous risks that shaped early human psychology and culture in profound ways. Hunters faced the very real possibility of death every time they engaged with these massive animals. This constant exposure to mortal danger created selection pressures that favored individuals who could remain calm under extreme stress, make quick decisions in life-threatening situations, and maintain their effectiveness as part of a team even when facing terrifying odds. The psychological toll of mammoth hunting was managed through cultural innovations that we can still see echoes of today. Early humans developed rituals and ceremonies around hunting that served to build courage, reinforce group bonds, and provide emotional support for those who risked their lives to feed the community. These weren't just superstitious practices. They were sophisticated psychological technologies designed to help people function effectively in extremely high-stress situations. Mammoth hunting also drove innovations in clothing and personal equipment that were essential for survival in Ice Age conditions. Hunters needed gear that would keep them warm and dry during long periods of waiting and stalking, but that wouldn't restrict their movement when quick action was required. They developed layered clothing systems using mammoth fur and hide that provided insulation while maintaining flexibility. The success of early human mammoth hunting had ecological implications that extended far beyond the immediate hunting groups. As humans became more effective at hunting these massive animals, they began to influence mammoth population dynamics and behavior patterns. Some researchers believe that human hunting pressure may have been one of the factors that eventually led to mammoth extinction at the end of the Ice Age. But in the short term, the mastery of mammoth hunting gave early humans access to resources that allowed them to survive and thrive in environments that would have been completely uninhabitable without this capability. It was a technological and social breakthrough that opened up vast new territories for human expansion and created the foundation for even more sophisticated survival strategies. As we'll see in the next part of our journey, the innovations that came from mammoth hunting, the social cooperation it required, and the resources it provided set the stage for another crucial adaptation that would prove equally important for Ice Age survival. Early humans were about to revolutionize not just how they obtained food, but how they protected themselves from the brutal elements that threatened to freeze them out of existence entirely. The story of mammoth hunting is really the story of humans learning to think collectively, to plan strategically, and to take calculated risks in pursuit of rewards that could sustain entire communities. These skills, developed in the crucible of Ice Age survival, would become the foundation for every major human achievement that followed. The innovations that emerged from mammoth hunting were about to transform into something even more fundamental to survival. Because once early humans had mastered the art of obtaining massive amounts of resources from these Ice Age giants, they faced an entirely new challenge that would push their ingenuity to its absolute limits. How do you stay alive when the very air around you can kill you in minutes? This brings us to one of the most crucial developments in human survival during the Ice Age. The creation of clothing and shelter systems so sophisticated, so perfectly adapted to extreme conditions, that they rival anything we might design today with all our modern technology and material science. Picture yourself standing naked in an Ice Age landscape. Within minutes, your core body temperature would begin dropping. Within an hour, you'd be experiencing hypothermia. Within a few hours, you'd be dead. The human body, remarkable as it is, simply wasn't designed for the kind of sustained cold that characterized much of the inhabited world during this period. But early humans didn't just figure out how to cover themselves with animal skins and call it good. They developed textile technologies that were nothing short of revolutionary. They learned to select different types of fur for different purposes, understanding that mammoth hair provided different insulation properties than reindeer fur, which was different again from the pelts of smaller animals. The process of turning a freshly killed animal into life-saving clothing was incredibly complex and required knowledge that had to be learned through generations of trial and error. First, the hide had to be removed from the carcass without damaging it, a skill that required understanding animal anatomy and having the right tools for precision cutting. Then came the crucial process of treating the hide to prevent it from rotting, stiffening, or becoming brittle in extreme cold. Early humans developed chemical processes using animal brains, plant materials, and other organic compounds to tan hides in ways that kept them flexible and water-resistant, even in sub-zero temperatures. This wasn't guesswork. This was sophisticated chemistry applied without laboratories or textbooks. Knowledge gained through careful observation and passed down through generations. But the real breakthrough came in understanding layering systems. Early humans discovered that survival in extreme cold wasn't about having one incredibly thick layer of protection, but about creating multiple layers that worked together to trap warm air while allowing moisture to escape. They developed base layers made from soft, fine furs worn directly against the skin, insulating layers made from thicker materials, and outer shells designed to break wind and shed water. The sewing technologies they developed were equally impressive. Using needles carved from bone and thread made from animal sinew, early humans could create clothing with seams that were both waterproof and flexible. They learned to make boots that could keep feet warm and dry while walking through snow for hours, mittens that provided warmth while still allowing enough dexterity for tool use, and hoods and face coverings that protected against frostbite while still allowing clear vision and breathing. These weren't simple garments thrown together for basic protection. Archaeological evidence shows Ice Age clothing that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of ergonomics, weather resistance, and thermal efficiency. Some garments show evidence of repair and modification, suggesting they were valuable enough to maintain and improve over long periods of use. The social implications of clothing production during the Ice Age were enormous. Creating a full set of cold weather gear for a single person required the hides from multiple animals, hundreds of hours of skilled labor, and access to specialized tools and materials. This meant that clothing production became a community effort that required cooperation and resource sharing on a scale that strengthened social bonds and created interdependencies that held groups together. Women, men, and children all participated in different aspects of clothing production, from hunting the animals that provided materials to the final stitching and fitting of completed garments. This created opportunities for knowledge transfer and skill development that crossed gender and age lines, ensuring that critical survival technologies were preserved and improved across generations. But clothing was only half the equation. Early humans also had to master the art of creating shelters that could protect them from wind, snow, and temperatures that could drop to lethal levels. And here again, they didn't just find caves and huddle inside. They became architects and engineers, designing structures that maximized warmth while minimizing the resources needed to heat them. In regions where natural caves weren't available, early humans learned to build shelters using the materials they had access to. The most ingenious of these were the mammoth bone huts found at archaeological sites across northern Europe and Asia. These weren't crude lean-tos. They were sophisticated structures that used mammoth skulls, ribs, and leg bones as structural elements, arranged in patterns that provided maximum stability and interior space while using minimum materials. The engineering principles behind these bone huts were remarkably advanced. Early humans understood load distribution, how to create foundations that wouldn't shift in freeze-thaw cycles, and how to design entrances that minimized heat loss while still providing access. They learned to orient their shelters to take advantage of natural windbreaks and solar heating, and to arrange interior spaces for maximum efficiency in cooking, sleeping, and tool-making activities. The covering systems for these shelters were equally sophisticated. Layers of hide were arranged to create insulating air spaces, with the outermost layer designed to shed water and the inner layers designed to trap warm air. Some shelters show evidence of smoke management systems, ways of venting fires without losing too much heat, that required understanding of airflow dynamics that wouldn't be formally studied for thousands of years. Inside these shelters, early humans created microenvironments that were not just survivable, but actually comfortable by any standard. Archaeological evidence shows sleeping areas with carefully arranged fur bedding, workspaces with tool storage and preparation areas, and central hearths designed for maximum heating efficiency. These weren't temporary camping spots. These were homes, designed and built by people who understood that survival required not just staying alive, but maintaining the physical and psychological health needed for long-term success. The heating systems developed for Ice Age shelters were particularly ingenious. Early humans learned to use heated stones as thermal mass, warming rocks in fires and then bringing them inside to provide radiant heat that lasted for hours. They developed oil lamps using animal fat that could provide both light and heat with minimal smoke production. Most importantly, they mastered the art of designing fires that burned efficiently in enclosed spaces without creating dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. These heating innovations required understanding combustion chemistry, airflow management, and fuel efficiency that went far beyond simply keeping a fire burning. Early humans had to balance the need for warmth against the risks of fire in enclosed spaces, the need to conserve fuel against the need for continuous heat, and the need for ventilation against the need for insulation. The psychological benefits of well-designed shelters during the Ice Age cannot be overstated. In an environment where everything outside the shelter was potentially lethal, having a warm, dry, secure space to retreat to was essential for mental health and group morale. These shelters became centers of social life, places where stories were told, knowledge was shared, and the social bonds that held groups together were maintained and strengthened. Shelter construction also became a form of technology transfer and cultural expression. Different groups developed distinctive architectural styles and construction techniques that reflected their specific environmental challenges and available materials. These regional variations in shelter design created cultural identities and traditions that were passed down through generations. The maintenance and improvement of shelters required ongoing community effort and provided opportunities for innovation and experimentation. Early humans constantly refined their construction techniques, tested new materials and designs, and shared successful innovations with other groups they encountered during migrations or trade contacts. Perhaps most remarkably, early humans learned to make their shelters portable when necessary. They developed techniques for creating temporary structures that could be assembled quickly from standardized components, allowing groups to maintain protection from the elements, even when they had to move frequently to follow animal herds or escape deteriorating conditions. The clothing and shelter technologies developed during the Ice Age represented a complete mastery of the materials and engineering principles available to early humans. They created systems that were not just adequate for survival, but optimized for efficiency, comfort, and durability. These innovations allowed humans to extend their range into environments that would have been completely uninhabitable without them. But these technologies also transformed human society in ways that extended far beyond their immediate practical applications. The complex production processes required for creating advanced clothing and shelters necessitated new forms of social organization, specialization, and cooperation. They created economic systems based on resource sharing and skill exchange that laid the foundation for more complex societies. The knowledge systems required to maintain these technologies also drove the development of more sophisticated forms of communication and education. The technical knowledge needed to create effective cold weather gear and shelters was too complex to be learned through casual observation. It required systematic teaching, practice, and knowledge preservation that may have accelerated the development of human language and culture. As we'll see next, these innovations in clothing and shelter technology set the stage for another crucial adaptation that would prove equally important for Ice Age survival. Early humans were about to discover that surviving the harshest period in recent Earth history required not just individual adaptations, but entirely new ways of organizing themselves as social groups and communities. As remarkable as these individual innovations were, perhaps the most crucial breakthrough in Ice Age survival wasn't technological at all. It was social. Because when you're facing conditions that can kill you in hours, when resources are scarce and dangers are everywhere, the difference between life and death often comes down to one simple question: can you trust the people around you? This brings us to what might be the most underappreciated aspect of Ice Age survival. The development of social cooperation systems so sophisticated, so finely tuned to the demands of extreme survival, that they fundamentally changed what it meant to be human. We're not just talking about people working together, we're talking about the emergence of social technologies that were every bit as revolutionary as fire or advanced toolmaking. Imagine for a moment the trust required for Ice Age hunting. You're part of a group planning to take down a mammoth. Success means food for weeks. Failure could mean death for multiple people. The hunt requires you to rely completely on the actions of others, people who need to perform their roles perfectly under life-threatening pressure. There's no room for selfishness, no tolerance for individuals who put their own interests ahead of the group's survival. This level of cooperation didn't happen overnight. It required the development of social institutions, unwritten rules and customs that governed how groups made decisions, resolved conflicts, and distributed resources. Early humans had to figure out how to maintain group cohesion during the long, dark months when tensions could explode into violence, when the psychological pressure of survival could tear communities apart. They developed systems for sharing food that went far beyond simple fairness. When a hunting party brought down a large animal, the distribution of meat had to account for who participated in the hunt, who contributed tools or knowledge, who was responsible for processing the kill, and who would be expected to contribute to future hunts. These weren't casual arrangements. They were complex social contracts that required memory, reciprocity, and long-term thinking. But perhaps, most remarkably, early humans developed systems for caring for group members who couldn't directly contribute to survival efforts. Archaeological evidence shows that Ice Age groups supported individuals with severe injuries, physical disabilities, and advanced age, people who, in purely practical terms, represented a drain on limited resources. This wasn't sentimentality. This was strategic social planning that recognized the value of accumulated knowledge and the importance of maintaining group morale. The decision-making processes that emerged during this period were equally sophisticated. Groups had to make life-or-death choices about when to move, where to hunt, how to respond to threats, and how to allocate scarce resources. These decisions couldn't be made by single leaders acting on whim. They required consultation, debate, and consensus-building processes that took into account different perspectives and areas of expertise. Leadership during the Ice Age was fluid and situational. The person who guided a mammoth hunt might not be the same individual who made decisions about where to establish winter camps or how to resolve disputes between group members. Early humans developed social systems that recognized different types of expertise and allowed leadership to shift based on the specific challenges being faced. These social innovations had profound effects on human psychology and culture. Living in such tight-knit, interdependent groups required individuals to develop emotional intelligence, empathy, and communication skills that went far beyond what was needed for basic survival. Early humans had to learn to read subtle social cues, manage their own emotions under stress, and maintain positive relationships, even when resources were scarce and tensions were high. The storytelling traditions that emerged during this period served multiple functions that were crucial for group survival. Stories weren't just entertainment during long winter nights. They were technologies for preserving and transmitting crucial survival knowledge. A story about a successful hunt could encode information about animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and hunting techniques. A tale about a group that failed to cooperate could serve as a cautionary reminder about the importance of social cohesion. These oral traditions also served to create shared identities and values that held groups together across generations. Stories about ancestors, about the origins of important technologies, about the proper relationships between humans and the natural world, created cultural frameworks that helped individuals understand their roles and responsibilities within the group. The development of more sophisticated communication during this period wasn't just about language. Early humans created complex systems of nonverbal communication, gestural languages that could convey detailed information about hunting strategies, environmental conditions, and social relationships. These communication systems were essential for coordinating group activities and maintaining social bonds, even when verbal communication wasn't possible or practical. Religious and spiritual practices that emerged during the Ice Age also served important social functions. Ritual activities created shared experiences that reinforced group identity and provided psychological comfort during periods of extreme stress. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and burial practices from this period suggest that early humans were developing belief systems that helped them cope with the uncertainties and dangers of their environment while strengthening social connections. The mate selection and family formation patterns that developed during this period were also shaped by survival requirements. Partnerships had to be based not just on personal attraction, but on complementary skills and the ability to work together effectively under pressure. Child rearing became a community responsibility, with multiple adults involved in teaching essential survival skills and cultural knowledge. These social innovations created feedback loops that accelerated human cultural and cognitive development. Groups with better cooperation were more successful at hunting, more effective at surviving harsh conditions, and better able to accumulate and preserve knowledge. This success allowed them to support larger populations, which created more opportunities for specialization and innovation. The trade networks that began to develop during this period represent another crucial social innovation. Different regions had access to different resources. High-quality stone for tool-making wasn't available everywhere. Certain types of shells, pigments, and other materials had to be obtained through exchange with distant groups. These trade relationships required trust, communication across language barriers, and systems for establishing value and maintaining long-term relationships. Archaeological evidence shows that some materials traveled hundreds of miles during the Ice Age, indicating trade networks that spanned vast distances and multiple cultural groups. These networks weren't just about obtaining materials. They were about sharing knowledge, techniques, and innovations that helped all participating groups improve their survival capabilities. The conflict resolution mechanisms that developed during this period were equally important. In small groups where everyone's survival depended on cooperation, disputes couldn't be allowed to escalate into violence or permanent divisions. Early humans developed sophisticated systems for mediating conflicts, restoring relationships, and maintaining group harmony even after serious disagreements. These social technologies also had to account for the psychological stresses of Ice Age life. Living in constant proximity to the same small group of people, dealing with the ongoing threat of death, managing the frustrations of scarcity and hardship, all created mental health challenges that could threaten group survival. Early humans developed cultural practices for managing stress, providing emotional support, and maintaining individual psychological health within the constraints of group living. The seasonal rhythms of Ice Age life created additional social challenges that required innovative solutions. During the harsh winter months, groups might be confined to shelters for weeks at a time, creating intense social pressures in cramped conditions. During summer hunting seasons, the same people had to work together in high-stress, dangerous situations that required perfect coordination. Early humans developed social technologies that allowed them to maintain effective relationships across these dramatically different social contexts. Perhaps most remarkably, the social systems developed during the Ice Age had to be robust enough to survive the death or departure of key individuals. Knowledge, skills, and social roles had to be distributed and backed up in ways that prevented the loss of a single person from destroying the group's survival capabilities. This required redundancy, cross-training, and succession planning that demonstrated remarkable foresight and social intelligence. The child development practices that emerged during this period reflect the sophisticated understanding early humans had developed about the importance of social cooperation. Children weren't just protected and fed. They were systematically trained in the social skills, emotional regulation, and cooperative behaviors that would be essential for their survival as adults. This socialization process began in infancy and continued throughout childhood and adolescence. The integration of new members into existing groups, whether through birth, marriage, or adoption, required careful social management. New individuals had to learn not just practical survival skills, but the specific social customs, communication patterns, and cooperative behaviors that characterized their new group. This integration process had to balance the need for social cohesion with the benefits of bringing in new knowledge and genetic diversity. These social innovations created the foundation for human civilization in ways that are still visible today. The cooperative behaviors, communication skills, and social institutions that were developed during the Ice Age became the building blocks for every subsequent human society. The trust, reciprocity, and collective action capabilities that allowed small groups to survive in impossible conditions scaled up to create villages, cities, and nations. As we'll see in our next exploration of Ice Age survival, these social technologies were about to be tested by one of the most challenging aspects of life during this period. Because mastering cooperation within a single group was only the beginning. Early humans were about to face the challenge of maintaining their societies while constantly moving across vast, dangerous territories in pursuit of the resources they needed to survive. The story of Ice Age social cooperation is ultimately the story of humans learning to transcend their individual limitations through collective action. It's about small groups of people discovering that their survival depended not on being stronger or faster or tougher than the challenges they faced, but on being smarter, more coordinated, and more committed to each other's welfare than any other species on Earth. These weren't modern humans with thousands of years of cultural development behind them. These were people facing circumstances that would challenge our most advanced societies today, and they succeeded not through superior technology or favorable conditions, but through their ability to work together in ways that multiplied their individual capabilities exponentially. The social innovations of the Ice Age represent one of humanity's greatest achievements, technologies of cooperation that were every bit as crucial for survival as fire, tools, or shelter. They created the social foundation that would allow early humans to not just survive the Ice Age, but to emerge from it ready to spread across the entire planet and build the complex civilizations that followed. But all of these innovations, all of this careful social engineering and technological development meant nothing if early humans couldn't solve one final crucial challenge. They had to figure out how to keep their communities alive and functioning while constantly moving across some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, following the animals and resources they needed to survive in a world that was changing faster than any human society had ever had to adapt before. This challenge of mobility during the Ice Age wasn't just about packing up and walking to a new location. We're talking about coordinating the movement of entire communities across landscapes that could kill unprepared travelers in a matter of hours. Imagine trying to move 30 people, including children and elderly members, across frozen rivers, where a single mistake could send someone plunging through ice into water so cold that survival time is measured in minutes. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about our Ice Age ancestors. They didn't just figure out how to survive these journeys. They turned mobility into an art form, developing navigation techniques and travel technologies that allowed them to cross continents with a precision that would impress modern explorers. The first challenge was simply knowing where to go. In a world without maps, GPS, or even permanent landmarks that might be buried under snow for months at a time, early humans had to develop mental mapping capabilities that boggle the modern mind. They learned to read the landscape like a book, recognizing subtle features that remained consistent even when everything else changed with the seasons. Star navigation became crucial during this period. Early humans developed sophisticated understanding of celestial movements, learning to use the positions of stars and constellations to maintain direction during long journeys. This wasn't casual stargazing. This was precision navigation that required memorizing complex stellar patterns and understanding how they changed throughout the year. But perhaps even more impressive was their ability to read weather patterns and predict environmental conditions days or even weeks in advance. A wrong decision about when to begin a journey could strand a group in deadly conditions. Early humans learned to interpret cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and dozens of other environmental cues to make life or death decisions about travel timing. The logistics of moving an entire community were staggering. Every tool, every piece of clothing, every scrap of preserved food had to be portable. This meant that early humans had to constantly balance the benefits of having more equipment against the costs of carrying it. They developed packaging and carrying systems that maximized utility walk long distances in harsh conditions. But these migrations, infants and toddlers couldn't while minimizing weight and bulk. Children presented particular challenges during they still needed to be kept warm, fed, and safe during journeys that could last for weeks. Early humans developed sophisticated child-carrying systems, from slings that kept babies close to their mother's body heat to sleds that could transport multiple children across snow and ice. The elderly and disabled weren't left behind during these migrations. Archaeological evidence shows that Ice Age groups continued to care for individuals who couldn't contribute directly to travel or hunting efforts. This required developing transportation methods for people who couldn't walk long distances, medical care systems for treating injuries and illnesses during travel, and social support networks that ensured no one was abandoned. Route planning for Ice Age migrations required thinking on multiple timescales simultaneously. Groups had to consider immediate needs like finding shelter and water for the next few days, medium-term requirements like reaching seasonal hunting grounds, and long-term objectives like positioning themselves for survival through the next winter. This kind of complex planning required cognitive abilities and social coordination that pushed the boundaries of human intelligence. Water sources were critical waypoints for any Ice Age journey. Early humans had to know not just where to find water, but how to recognize safe water sources, how to melt ice and snow safely, and how to carry water supplies when traveling between sources. They developed containers made from animal bladders and stomach linings that could hold water without adding significant weight to their travel loads. The travel itself was physically demanding in ways that are hard to imagine. Walking through deep snow while carrying heavy loads, maintaining body heat while staying active enough to keep moving, navigating around obstacles like rivers and crevasses that could appear suddenly in changing conditions. Early humans had to develop physical conditioning and endurance capabilities that allowed them to maintain this level of activity for weeks at a time. But travel during the Ice Age wasn't just about physical challenges. The psychological stress of constant movement, of never having a permanent safe place to rest, of always being vulnerable to sudden changes in weather or other dangers, created mental health challenges that could destroy group cohesion. Early humans developed cultural practices and social support systems that helped individuals cope with the psychological demands of nomadic life. Communication during travel required special techniques and technologies. Groups spread out over long distances needed ways to stay in contact, to coordinate movements, and to share information about conditions ahead. Early humans developed signaling systems using smoke, reflected light, and sound that allowed them to communicate across distances that would otherwise make coordination impossible. The timing of migrations was crucial and required sophisticated understanding of animal behavior patterns, weather cycles, and resource availability. Leave too early, and you might arrive at hunting grounds before the animals get there. Leave too late, and you might miss the brief window when conditions allow safe travel. Early humans had to balance dozens of different factors to optimize their movement timing. Emergency procedures for travel were equally important. When storms hit unexpectedly, when someone was injured, when equipment was lost or damaged, groups needed predetermined responses that could save lives. Early humans developed contingency planning that accounted for multiple types of emergencies and ensured that everyone knew their roles in crisis situations. The social dynamics of travel created unique challenges and opportunities. People who might get along fine in a settled camp could develop serious conflicts when stressed by the demands of constant movement. Early humans had to develop conflict resolution techniques that could work during travel, when there was no option to separate feuding individuals or take time for extended mediation processes. Food procurement during travel required entirely different strategies than settled hunting and gathering. Groups couldn't rely on large-scale hunts that required days of preparation and processing. They had to develop techniques for obtaining food on the move, for recognizing and exploiting opportunities as they arose, and for maintaining nutrition and energy levels during periods of intense physical activity. Tool maintenance during travel was another crucial skill. When your survival depends on your equipment and you're hundreds of miles from the materials needed to make replacements, keeping tools in working condition becomes a matter of life and death. Early humans developed field repair techniques and carried specialized tool-making materials that allowed them to maintain their equipment during long journeys. The seasonal timing of migrations had to account for multiple overlapping cycles. Animal migration patterns, weather systems, resource availability, and travel conditions all followed different schedules that sometimes conflicted with each other. Early humans had to develop sophisticated scheduling abilities that optimized their movements across all these different variables. Safety during travel required constant vigilance and specialized knowledge. Recognizing dangerous ice conditions, avoiding predators, identifying poisonous plants, and dealing with injuries in remote locations all required expertise that could mean the difference between successful migration and disaster. Early humans developed training systems that ensured multiple group members had the knowledge needed to handle travel emergencies. The equipment innovations that emerged from Ice Age travel requirements were remarkable. Portable shelters that could be assembled quickly in harsh conditions, specialized footwear for different types of terrain, carrying systems that distributed weight efficiently while allowing quick access to essential items. These weren't crude makeshift solutions. These were sophisticated technologies optimized for specific performance requirements. Navigation backup systems were essential for groups traveling in conditions where landmarks might be obscured or where a single navigation error could be fatal. Early humans developed multiple independent methods for determining direction and position, ensuring that they could maintain their course even when primary navigation methods failed. The social roles that emerged around travel were highly specialized. Some individuals became expert pathfinders, others specialized in weather prediction. Still others focused on managing the logistics of moving large groups. This specialization created interdependencies that strengthened group bonds while ensuring that crucial travel skills were preserved and developed. Communication with other groups during travel was both a survival necessity and a source of valuable information. Meeting other travelers could provide updates on conditions ahead, opportunities for trade, and social contact that helped maintain mental health during long periods of isolation. Early humans developed protocols for these interactions that balanced the benefits of contact with the risks of conflict or disease transmission. The camp management skills required for travel were completely different from those needed for settled living. Temporary camps had to be established quickly, had to provide adequate protection and comfort for the time available, and had to be broken down efficiently without leaving behind valuable resources. Early humans developed systematic approaches to camp establishment that maximized efficiency while minimizing the time and energy spent on setup and breakdown. Resource caching was another crucial travel technology. Groups would hide supplies at strategic locations along migration routes, creating networks of emergency resources that could save lives if conditions deteriorated unexpectedly. This required remarkable memory abilities and coordination between different groups that might use the same routes at different times. The physical conditioning required for Ice Age travel pushed human physiological capabilities to their limits. Early humans had to maintain cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, and endurance that allowed them to function effectively under extreme conditions for extended periods. This conditioning was maintained through daily activities, and probably through specific training practices that prepared individuals for the demands of migration. Leadership during travel required different skills than leadership in settled communities. Travel leaders had to make rapid decisions under pressure, coordinate complex movements involving multiple individuals, and maintain group morale during periods of extreme stress and discomfort. The leadership abilities that emerged during this period created templates for human authority and decision-making that influenced social development for thousands of years. The legacy of Ice Age mobility is still visible in human psychology and culture today. Our restlessness, our curiosity about what lies beyond the horizon, our ability to adapt to new environments and circumstances, all trace back to ancestors who spent thousands of years constantly moving across changing landscapes in pursuit of survival. But perhaps most importantly, The mobility requirements of Ice Age survival created selection pressures that favored individuals and groups with exceptional planning abilities, stress tolerance, and social cooperation skills. The humans who survived this period weren't just physically tough, they were cognitively flexible, emotionally resilient, and socially sophisticated in ways that set the stage for every subsequent human achievement. The story of Ice Age mobility is ultimately a story about humans learning to see the entire planet as their potential habitat. It's about people who refuse to be constrained by environmental barriers, who develop the technologies and social systems needed to cross any terrain and adapt to any conditions. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing disaster. These were explorers and pioneers who turned the challenge of constant movement into an opportunity for expansion and discovery. As we'll see in our next exploration of Ice Age survival, these mobility innovations were about to be tested by an even greater challenge, because surviving as small mobile groups was only the beginning. Early humans were about to encounter other human species in the same territories, leading to interactions that would fundamentally reshape the genetic and cultural future of humanity itself. The mastery of Ice Age mobility represents one of humanity's most underappreciated achievements. It was the technology that allowed our ancestors to spread across the globe, to explore and settle every habitable continent, and to become the most widely distributed species in Earth's history. Without these mobility innovations, humans might have remained confined to small refugees during the Ice Age, never developing the global perspective and adaptive capabilities that would eventually allow us to reshape the entire planet. But this incredible mobility also brought early humans into contact with creatures and challenges that would test every survival skill they had developed. Because the Ice Age wasn't just about surviving the cold and finding food. It was about learning to share the world with other intelligent beings who had their own survival strategies, their own technologies, and their own claims to the resources that everyone needed to stay alive. This collision of human species during the Ice Age wasn't just a footnote in prehistory. It was one of the most consequential encounters in the entire story of life on Earth. And nowhere was this more dramatic than the meeting between our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, and their cousins who had already mastered Ice Age survival for hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals. Picture the moment when these two species first encountered each other. Homo sapiens, relatively new arrivals to the frozen landscapes of Europe, carrying their own hard-won survival technologies and social innovations. Neanderthals, the original Ice Age specialists, built like living tanks for cold weather survival, with bodies perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions and hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about thriving in glacial environments. The Neanderthals weren't primitive cave dwellers waiting to be replaced by superior newcomers. These were sophisticated survivors who had already solved most of the problems that Homo sapiens were just beginning to face. They had stockier, more muscular builds that conserved body heat more efficiently in extreme cold. Their large nasal cavities warmed frigid air before it reached their lungs. Their robust bone structure could withstand the physical demands of Ice Age life in ways that the more lightly built Homo sapiens couldn't match. But perhaps most importantly, Neanderthals had been perfecting Ice Age survival techniques for generations before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe. They had developed sophisticated stone tool technologies, created complex hunting strategies for taking down mammoth and other large game, and established social systems that had kept their populations alive through multiple glacial cycles. When these two species met, it wasn't a case of advanced humans encountering primitive relatives. It was a meeting between two different solutions to the same impossible survival challenge. And what happened next would determine which approach, or which combination of approaches, would carry humanity forward into the post-Ice Age world. The territories where these encounters took place were some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The borderlands between ice sheets and habitable regions, places where resources were scarce and competition was intense. Both species were already operating at the limits of their survival capabilities. Adding competition from another intelligent species created pressures that pushed both groups to their absolute breaking points. But something remarkable happened instead of the violent conflict that many people imagine. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals didn't just fight each other for resources. They learned from each other, traded with each other, and in some cases, even formed partnerships that benefited both species. Tool technologies began to cross between the two groups. Neanderthal techniques for working stone and bone started appearing in Homo sapiens sites. Innovations that had been developed by Homo sapiens began showing up in Neanderthal settlements. This wasn't casual borrowing. This was systematic technology transfer that required sustained contact and communication between the two species. The evidence goes even deeper than shared technologies. Genetic analysis of modern human DNA has revealed that virtually everyone of non-African descent carries Neanderthal genetic material in their cells. This means that at some point during the Ice Age, members of these two species didn't just meet and trade. They formed relationships, started families together, and created hybrid offspring who carried forward the genetic advantages of both lineages. Think about what this means in practical terms. In an environment where every advantage mattered for survival, where a single beneficial trait could mean the difference between a group living or dying through a harsh winter, the genetic combinations that resulted from Homo sapiens and Neanderthal interbreeding created individuals with survival capabilities that exceeded what either species could achieve alone. Some of the genes that modern humans inherited from Neanderthals appear to be related to immune system function. This makes perfect sense when you consider that Homo sapiens moving into new territories would have encountered diseases and pathogens that they had no previous exposure to. Neanderthal genes that had been selected over hundreds of thousands of years for surviving in these environments could have provided crucial resistance to local diseases. Other Neanderthal genetic contributions seem to be related to cold tolerance and metabolism. Again, this would have been incredibly valuable for Homo sapiens groups trying to adapt to Ice Age conditions. The combination of Homo sapiens innovation and adaptability with Neanderthal cold weather specializations created hybrid populations that were better equipped for Ice Age survival than either parent species. But the relationship between these two species wasn't just about genetics, it was also about cultural exchange on a scale that transformed both groups. Neanderthals had accumulated hundreds of thousands of years of knowledge about Ice Age survival. They knew which plants remained edible during the harshest winters, which cave systems provided the best shelter, which animal behaviors predicted changes in weather patterns. Homo sapiens brought their own innovations to these encounters, their more advanced tool-making techniques, their sophisticated social organization systems, their innovations in hunting strategies and shelter construction. When these knowledge bases combined, the result was a quantum leap in Ice Age survival capabilities. The artistic expressions that begin appearing during this period also suggest cultural exchange between the species. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and decorative objects start showing up in both Homo sapiens and Neanderthal sites, often with remarkably similar themes and techniques. This suggests not just parallel development, but actual communication and shared cultural practices between the two species. The hunting strategies that emerged during the period of overlap show clear evidence of combined innovations, techniques that use the best elements of both Homo sapiens' flexibility and Neanderthal specialized knowledge. Mammoth hunting sites from this period show levels of efficiency and success that exceed what either species achieved independently. But perhaps most intriguingly, the social structures that developed during this period of coexistence created new forms of cooperation that went beyond what either species had developed alone. Mixed groups that included both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, or hybrid individuals who combined the best traits of both lineages, appear to have been particularly successful at surviving in the most challenging Ice Age environments. The communication challenges that these interactions required may have accelerated the development of language and symbolic expression in both species. When you need to coordinate complex activities with individuals who don't share your exact biological heritage or cultural background, you need more sophisticated communication tools than simple gesture and basic vocalization. The trade networks that developed during this period also show evidence of cooperation between the species. High-quality materials like flint, ochre, and marine shells appear in sites hundreds of miles from their sources, suggesting trade relationships that crossed species boundaries. This wasn't just opportunistic exchange. This was systematic economic cooperation that required trust and long-term planning. The territorial arrangements that emerged during coexistence were also sophisticated. Rather than constant warfare over the same resources, there's evidence that different groups, including mixed species groups, developed seasonal use patterns that allowed multiple populations to exploit the same areas without direct conflict. This required negotiation abilities and social planning that pushed both species toward more complex forms of organization. The child-rearing practices that developed during this period show evidence of cross-species cooperation in education and socialization. Hybrid children would have needed to learn survival techniques from both biological heritages. This created educational systems that were more comprehensive and adaptable than what either species had developed independently. The medical knowledge that accumulated during this period also shows signs of combination and enhancement. Neanderthal knowledge of cold weather injuries and treatments combined with Homo sapiens innovations in tool-based medical interventions. The result was healthcare capabilities that were more advanced than what either species could provide alone. But the most profound impact of these species interactions may have been psychological. Living and working with individuals who were clearly intelligent and capable, but who approached problems differently and had different strengths and limitations, would have expanded the mental horizons of both species. It would have demonstrated that there were multiple ways to solve survival challenges, multiple approaches to social organization, multiple ways of understanding and interacting with the environment. This cognitive flexibility, this ability to see beyond the limitations of a single approach to survival, may have been one of the most important legacies of Ice Age species interaction. It created humans who were not just adapted to specific environments, but who were adaptable to changing conditions and new challenges in ways that would prove crucial as the Ice Age ended and new opportunities emerged. The seasonal rhythms that governed these interactions were also complex and sophisticated. During the harshest winter months, cooperation was essential for survival. During summer hunting seasons, the same groups might compete for prime hunting territories. Managing these shifting relationships required social intelligence and emotional regulation that pushed both species toward greater psychological sophistication. The technological innovations that emerged from these interactions weren't just improvements on existing tools and techniques. They were entirely new approaches that combined different ways of thinking about problems. Composite tools that used the best materials and techniques from both species' traditions. Hunting strategies that combined Neanderthal knowledge of animal behavior with Homo sapiens innovations in weapon design. The shelter technologies that developed during this period show similar patterns of innovation through combination. Neanderthal expertise in selecting and modifying natural shelters combined with Homo sapiens innovations in constructed shelters. The result was housing that was more comfortable, more durable, and more energy efficient than what either species achieved independently. The food processing techniques that emerged during coexistence also show evidence of knowledge combination. Neanderthal understanding of which plants and animals remained nutritious during different seasons, combined with Homo sapiens innovations in cooking and preservation. This created dietary capabilities that were more diverse and reliable than what either species managed alone. The navigation and migration knowledge that accumulated during this period was particularly important. Neanderthal familiarity with European landscapes and climate patterns combined with Homo sapiens experience in long-distance migration and route planning. This created mobility capabilities that allowed mixed groups to exploit resources across much larger territories than either species could access independently. The conflict resolution mechanisms that developed for managing interspecies relationships were also sophisticated. When survival depends on cooperation between individuals who have different instincts, different communication styles, and different approaches to problem solving, you need advanced social technologies for preventing and resolving disputes. The leadership structures that emerged during this period had to account for the different strengths and capabilities of different species. A Neanderthal might be the best choice for leading a winter survival effort, while a Homo sapiens individual might be better suited for planning a long-distance migration. These flexible leadership systems created more effective group management than rigid hierarchies based on single criteria. The mate selection and family formation patterns that developed during coexistence were also complex. Partnerships had to account not just for individual compatibility, but for the genetic and pressures that favored individuals who could form cultural advantages that different combinations might provide to offspring. This created selection's successful relationships across species boundaries. The artistic and spiritual expressions that emerged during this period show evidence of shared meaning-making that transcended species differences. Cave paintings and carved objects that appear in both Homo sapiens and Neanderthal sites suggest shared symbolic systems and possibly shared spiritual practices that helped both species cope with the psychological challenges of Ice Age survival. The knowledge preservation systems that developed during coexistence were particularly important. With two different species contributing different types of expertise, groups needed more sophisticated ways of storing, organizing, and transmitting knowledge. This made result of these species interactions was a form of humanity that was more capable, more adept, have accelerated the development of more advanced memory techniques and cultural transmission methods, the enable and more resilient than any single species could have been independently. The humans who emerged from the period of coexistence carried forward genetic advantages, technological innovations, and cultural capabilities that had been forged through cooperation and competition between different approaches to Ice Age survival. But this period of coexistence was also temporary. As the Ice Age progressed and conditions continued to change, the balance between cooperation and competition shifted. Some species proved more adaptable to changing conditions. Others found their specialized adaptations becoming liabilities, as the world they had mastered began to disappear. The legacy of these interactions, however, continued long after the period of direct coexistence ended. The genetic contributions, the technological innovations, the social and cultural advances that emerged from species interaction became permanent parts of the human toolkit. They created capabilities that would prove essential as early humans faced the next great challenge in their survival story. Because as remarkable as the innovations of Ice Age survival were, they were all developed in response to a specific set of environmental conditions. What would happen when those conditions began to change? How would humans who had spent thousands of years perfecting techniques for surviving in a world of ice and snow adapt when that world started to disappear? The story of species interaction during the Ice Age is ultimately about the power of diversity and cooperation in the face of impossible challenges. It shows that survival isn't always about being the strongest or the most specialized. Sometimes it's about being able to learn from others, to combine different approaches, and to create solutions that transcend the limitations of any single perspective. These lessons, learned in the crucible of Ice Age survival, would prove essential as humanity faced the transition to an entirely different world. The genetic diversity, technological flexibility, and social cooperation capabilities that emerged from species interaction would become the foundation for human expansion and development in the post-Ice Age world. But first, our ancestors had to survive the most challenging aspect of Ice Age life. Because all of these innovations, all of this cooperation and genetic combination, all of these sophisticated survival technologies had to be maintained and transmitted while groups were constantly moving across some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, following the animals and resources they needed to stay alive in a world that never stopped changing. The real test of Ice Age survival wasn't just developing the right techniques, it was maintaining those techniques, preserving that knowledge, and passing those capabilities forward while living as nomadic hunters in an environment that could kill you if you made a single serious mistake. This challenge of cultural continuity in the face of constant mobility and mortal danger was about to push human social organization to entirely new levels of sophistication. The mobility and cooperation that allowed our ancestors to survive alongside other human species created an unexpected byproduct that would prove just as crucial for long-term survival. They had to become master trackers and followers, not just of individual animals, but of entire ecosystems on the move. Picture the scale of what we're talking about here. Massive herds of mammoth, reindeer, and bison that could stretch across the horizon. Hundreds of thousands of animals following ancient migration routes that spanned entire continents. These weren't casual movements. These were precisely timed journeys that followed the retreat and advance of ice sheets, the emergence and disappearance of grasslands, the seasonal availability of water and shelter. For early humans, these animal migrations represented both the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge of Ice Age survival. A single mammoth herd could provide enough resources to sustain multiple human groups for an entire season, but following these herds meant committing to journeys that could last for months, across terrain that changed constantly, with no guarantee that the animals would stop where humans could actually hunt them successfully. The tracking skills that early humans developed during this period were nothing short of supernatural by modern standards. They learned to read the landscape like a text, identifying the subtle signs that indicated where animals had passed days or even weeks earlier. A disturbed patch of ground, the angle of broken vegetation, the scent traces that lingered in the air, all became part of a complex information system that allowed human trackers to follow herds across vast distances. But this wasn't just about following footprints in the mud. Early humans had to understand animal psychology on a level that bordered on telepathy. They needed to predict where herds would go next, not just where they had been. This required understanding seasonal patterns, weather influences, predator pressures, and food availability in ways that allowed humans to anticipate animal movements and position themselves advantageously. The social organization required for following animal migrations was incredibly complex. Groups had to coordinate their movements with the unpredictable schedules of wild animals, while maintaining their own survival needs. Children had to be kept safe and healthy during long journeys. Elderly members needed care and transportation. Tools and supplies had to be maintained and replaced using materials found along the way. The communication systems that emerged during this period were particularly sophisticated. When human groups were spread out across miles of terrain, following different parts of the same herd, or tracking multiple animal groups simultaneously, they needed ways to share information about animal movements, environmental conditions, and hunting opportunities. Early humans developed signaling methods using smoke, sound, and visual markers that allowed coordination across distances that would challenge modern communication systems. The timing decisions involved in following migrations were life or death calculations that required processing enormous amounts of environmental information. Leave too early to follow a herd and you might arrive at their destination before they do, wasting crucial time and energy in an environment where both were precious. Wait too long and the animals might change course or the weather might make travel impossible. Early humans had to develop seasonal calendars that weren't based on fixed dates, but on complex interactions between weather patterns, animal behavior, plant growth cycles, and ice conditions. They needed to know not just when animals typically migrated, but how unusual weather might change those patterns, how predator pressure might alter routes, how human hunting pressure might influence herd behavior. The psychological challenges of following animal migrations were enormous. Groups of humans had to maintain their social cohesion and decision-making capabilities while constantly moving, never having a permanent base, always dependent on the movements of animals they couldn't control. The stress of this lifestyle would have tested the social technologies and cooperation systems that early humans had developed to their absolute limits. But perhaps most remarkably, following animal migrations required early humans to think like the animals they were tracking. They had to understand what drove migration decisions, what environmental cues animals responded to, what would make a herd change course or alter its timing. This cognitive empathy, this ability to model the mental processes of other species, pushed human intelligence in directions that would prove crucial for future development. The navigation challenges of following migrations were particularly complex because the routes themselves were constantly changing. Animal migration paths weren't like highways that stayed in the same place year after year. They shifted based on ice conditions, water levels, vegetation patterns, and dozens of other environmental factors. Early humans had to be able to navigate not just to specific locations, but to moving targets that might change direction without warning. The hunting strategies that developed around migration following were completely different from the stationary hunting techniques that worked in established territories. When animals are on the move, opportunities for complex trap construction or elaborate ambush preparation are limited. Early humans had to develop mobile hunting techniques that could be deployed quickly when opportunities arose, often with minimal preparation time. The resource management required for migration following was incredibly sophisticated. Groups had to carry everything they needed for survival while remaining mobile enough to keep up with moving herds. This meant developing portable technologies that were lightweight but durable, multi-purpose tools that could serve different functions, and storage systems that protected essential supplies during long journeys. The weather prediction skills that emerged during this period were crucial for survival during migration following. When you're traveling in the open, constantly exposed to changing conditions, the ability to anticipate storms, temperature changes, and other weather events becomes a matter of life and death. Early humans developed meteorological knowledge that allowed them to read cloud formations, wind patterns, animal behavior, and other environmental cues to predict weather changes days in advance. The camp management systems that developed for migration following had to balance the need for rapid deployment and breakdown with the requirement to provide adequate shelter and comfort for people who were constantly traveling. Early humans created modular shelter systems that could be assembled quickly in various configurations, depending on available materials, weather conditions, and the expected duration of stay. The food procurement strategies that worked during migration following were particularly challenging because they had to be executed while constantly moving. Early humans couldn't rely on time-intensive food processing techniques or elaborate preservation methods. They had to develop quick, efficient ways to obtain and prepare food that could be executed during brief stops or while actually traveling. The social roles that emerged around migration following were highly specialized and required individuals with exceptional skills in specific areas. Some people became expert animal behaviorists, able to predict herd movements with remarkable accuracy. Others specialized in navigation, weather prediction, or the logistics of moving large groups across difficult terrain. These specializations created interdependencies that strengthened group bonds while ensuring that crucial knowledge was preserved and developed. The territorial knowledge that accumulated during migration following was vast and detailed. Early humans had to maintain mental maps of enormous areas, remembering water sources, shelter locations, seasonal resource availability, and environmental hazards across territories that could span hundreds of miles. This geographical knowledge became a form of cultural wealth that was carefully preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. The risk management systems that developed during this period had to account for the unique dangers of constantly following moving animals across changing terrain. Groups needed contingency plans for situations where herds suddenly changed direction, where weather made travel impossible, where hunting opportunities failed to materialize, or where environmental conditions became too dangerous to continue. The equipment innovations that emerged from migration following were remarkable in their efficiency and versatility. Early humans developed portable hunting weapons that could be assembled quickly from standardized components, shelter systems that used minimal materials while providing maximum protection, and carrying equipment that distributed weight efficiently while allowing quick access to essential items. The leadership structures that governed migration following had to be flexible enough to adapt to rapidly changing conditions while maintaining group cohesion during periods of extreme stress. Decision-making systems had to balance the need for quick responses to changing animal behavior, with the requirement for group consensus on major directional changes that could affect everyone's survival. The communication protocols that developed for coordinating migration following were sophisticated systems that allowed groups to share information about animal movements, environmental conditions, and hunting opportunities across large areas. These weren't just simple signaling methods, but complex information networks that could coordinate the activities of multiple groups following the same herds or tracking different animal populations. The cultural practices that emerged around migration following served important psychological functions in maintaining group morale and identity during periods of constant movement and uncertainty. Rituals and ceremonies that could be performed quickly during brief stops, storytelling traditions that preserved crucial knowledge about animal behavior and environmental patterns, and social customs that reinforced group bonds during the stress of constant travel. The knowledge preservation systems that developed during this period had to account for the fact that crucial survival information had to be maintained and transmitted while groups were constantly moving and facing ongoing survival challenges. Early humans developed memory techniques, oral traditions, and cultural practices that ensured essential knowledge about animal behavior, navigation, and environmental patterns was preserved across generations. The health management systems that emerged during migration following addressed the unique medical challenges of constantly traveling groups. Early humans had to maintain the physical and mental health of all group members, while constantly moving, often in harsh conditions, with limited access to medicinal plants and other healing resources. This required developing portable medical knowledge and treatment techniques that could be applied during travel. The seasonal adaptation strategies that governed migration following were incredibly complex, requiring groups to adjust their following patterns, hunting techniques, and survival strategies as environmental conditions changed throughout the year. Early humans had to understand not just how animal behavior changed with the seasons, but how their own capabilities and requirements changed, and how to optimize their following strategies for different times of year. The territory sharing arrangements that developed between different human groups following the same animal populations were sophisticated systems that prevented conflict while allowing multiple groups to exploit the same resources. These weren't simple territorial agreements, but complex protocols that governed how different groups could coordinate their activities, share information, and avoid dangerous competition during critical hunting periods. The educational systems that emerged for training new generations in migration following techniques were comprehensive programs that began in early childhood and continued throughout an individual's development. Children learn not just practical skills like tracking and navigation, but the complex decision-making processes, environmental awareness, and social cooperation abilities that were essential for successful migration following. The long-distance communication networks that developed during this period allowed information about animal movements, environmental conditions, and hunting opportunities to be shared across vast territories. These networks weren't just local information sharing, but continent-spanning systems that allowed human groups to coordinate their activities with others they might never directly encounter. But following animal migrations also created opportunities that went far beyond immediate survival needs. As human groups tracked animals across vast distances, They were also exploring and mapping territories that had never been inhabited by humans before. They were discovering new resources, new environments, and new possibilities for human expansion that would prove crucial as the Ice Age eventually came to an end. The exploration that resulted from migration following wasn't just incidental discovery. Early humans were actively investigating new territories, assessing their potential for future settlement, and developing the geographical knowledge that would allow them to expand into new regions as conditions changed. This exploration mentality, this drive to understand and map new territories, became a fundamental part of human psychology that would drive expansion and discovery for thousands of years to come. The environmental knowledge that accumulated during migration following was encyclopedic in scope and detail. Early humans learned to read landscapes, weather patterns, and ecological systems with a precision that allowed them to predict resource availability, assess territorial potential, and make survival decisions based on subtle environmental cues that modern humans would never notice. The adaptive capabilities that developed during this period of constant movement and environmental change created humans who were not just specialized for specific conditions, but who were fundamentally adaptable to changing circumstances. The ability to thrive while following animal migrations required cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and technological innovation that could respond quickly to new challenges and opportunities. As we'll see in the next part of our journey through Ice Age survival, the skills and knowledge that early humans developed through following animal migrations were about to be tested by the ultimate challenge. Because the world they had learned to master, the environments they had adapted to, the animal populations they had learned to follow, were all about to undergo the most dramatic transformation in recent Earth history. The Ice Age was ending, and with it, everything that early humans had spent thousands of years learning to survive was about to disappear forever. The question was whether the adaptability, innovation, and cooperation they had developed during the harshest period in human history would be enough to carry them through the transition to an entirely new world. The story of following animal migrations during the Ice Age is ultimately a story about humans learning to live as part of dynamic, ever-changing natural systems, rather than trying to control or dominate those systems. It's about people who understood that their survival depended not on imposing their will on the environment, but on understanding and adapting to natural processes that were far larger and more powerful than any human group. These lessons in adaptation, flexibility, and environmental awareness would prove essential as early humans faced the challenges of a warming world where the survival strategies that had sustained them for thousands of years would no longer be adequate. The cognitive abilities, social cooperation, and technological innovation that had been honed through following migrations would become the foundation for humanity's next great leap forward. But first, they had to survive the transition itself. And that transition was about to test every survival skill, every social innovation, and every adaptive capability that early humans had developed during their long struggle against the ice. But surviving the end of the Ice Age wasn't just about adapting to a warming climate. It was about the complete transformation of everything early humans had spent millennia learning to master. As glaciers began their slow retreat around 12,000 years ago, our ancestors faced what might have been their greatest challenge yet. Not the challenge of survival, but the challenge of reinvention. Imagine waking up one day to find that the world you knew, the world your parents and grandparents and countless generations before them had mastered, was simply disappearing. The massive ice sheets that had defined the landscape were melting, creating vast lakes and rivers where none had existed before. The tundra that had supported enormous herds of mammoth and reindeer was giving way to forests that blocked traditional hunting grounds and migration routes. The animals that had been the foundation of human survival for thousands of years were struggling to adapt to the changing conditions. Some species, like the woolly mammoth, were heading toward extinction as their specialized cold weather adaptations became liabilities in a warming world. Others, were migrating to new territories, following the retreating ice toward the poles and leaving behind the human groups that had depended on them for survival. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about this period in human history. Instead of being overwhelmed by these changes, our ancestors saw opportunity where others saw disaster. The same cognitive flexibility and innovative thinking that had allowed them to survive the harshest conditions on Earth now enabled them to envision entirely new ways of living. The warming climate that threatened traditional Ice Age survival strategies also opened up possibilities that had never existed before. Regions that had been locked under ice for thousands of years were becoming habitable. Plants that had survived only in small refuges were spreading across vast new territories. Rivers and lakes were forming that could support entirely different types of food procurement and settlement patterns. Early humans began to experiment with ideas that would have been impossible during the height of the Ice Age. Instead of constantly following animal migrations, some groups started investigating the possibility of staying in one place for longer periods. They noticed that certain plants could be encouraged to grow more abundantly through careful tending. They observed that some animals might be manageable in captivity rather than only huntable in the wild. The tool technologies that had been perfected for hunting large Ice Age mammals were adapted for entirely new purposes. The same precision stoneworking techniques that had created mammoth hunting spears were now being used to make implements for processing plant foods, for woodworking in the newly expanding forests, for fishing in the rivers and lakes that were forming as ice sheets retreated. The social cooperation systems that had been essential for coordinating mammoth hunts and surviving harsh winters were now being applied to new challenges. Groups that had learned to work together to bring down dangerous prey were now collaborating on projects that required sustained effort over months or years. They were clearing land, constructing more permanent shelters, and developing storage systems for the more reliable food sources that were becoming available. The knowledge preservation systems that had been crucial for maintaining survival information during the constant movement of Ice Age life were now being used to accumulate and transmit entirely new types of knowledge. Information about plant cultivation, animal domestication, and seasonal management of resources that stayed in one place rather than constantly moving across the landscape. The navigation and territorial knowledge that early humans had developed during their nomadic period was now being applied to more intensive use of smaller areas. Instead of knowing migration routes that spanned continents, people were learning every detail of specific valleys, watersheds, and ecological zones that could support permanent or semi-permanent settlement. The seasonal planning abilities that had been essential for following animal migrations were being adapted for agricultural cycles. The same cognitive skills that had allowed early humans to predict when and where mammoth herds would appear were now being used to understand when to plant seeds, when to harvest crops, and when to prepare for winter in settled communities. The risk management systems that had been developed for surviving the uncertainties of nomadic life were being modified for the different but equally complex challenges of settled life. Instead of preparing for the unpredictability of animal movements and weather during travel, people were learning to plan for crop failures, storage problems, and the social challenges that arose when larger groups lived together permanently. The leadership structures that had evolved during the Ice Age were adapting to the needs of more complex, settled societies. The situational leadership that had worked for nomadic groups was giving way to more specialized and permanent forms of authority. People with expertise in plant cultivation, animal management, or territorial defense were taking on leadership roles that lasted beyond single hunting seasons or migration cycles. The trade networks that had developed during the Ice Age were expanding and becoming more sophisticated as settlements became more permanent and specialized. Groups that focused on particular types of resource production could trade their surplus for materials they couldn't produce themselves. This specialization created economic interdependencies that were more complex than anything that had existed during the nomadic period. The artistic and spiritual expressions that had emerged during the Ice Age were evolving to reflect the new realities of settled life. Cave paintings that had focused on hunting scenes and animal spirits were being supplemented by art that celebrated plant growth, seasonal cycles, and the relationship between humans and the landscapes they were beginning to modify and manage. The population dynamics that had been constrained by the carrying capacity of nomadic lifestyles were beginning to change dramatically. More reliable food sources and permanent shelters allowed groups to support larger populations. Children could survive in greater numbers, and adults could live longer, creating communities with more complex age structures and knowledge bases. The territorial arrangements that had governed nomadic groups were being replaced by more permanent land use patterns. Instead of seasonal access rights to migration routes and hunting grounds, people were developing concepts of ownership and stewardship that applied to specific pieces of territory that they modified and managed intensively. The educational systems that had focused on nomadic survival skills were expanding to include knowledge about plant cultivation, animal domestication, and the management of settled communities. Children were learning not just how to hunt and track, but how to tend crops, care for domestic animals, and maintain the infrastructure of permanent settlements. The health and medical systems that had been developed for nomadic life were being adapted for the different health challenges of settled communities. Living in closer proximity to domestic animals and accumulated waste created new disease risks that required different prevention and treatment strategies. But more stable food supplies and permanent shelters also created opportunities for better nutrition and more effective care of the sick and injured. The conflict resolution mechanisms that had worked for small nomadic groups were being scaled up for larger settled communities. When people couldn't simply move away from disputes, they needed more sophisticated systems for managing conflicts and maintaining social harmony within permanent settlements. The environmental management practices that emerged during this transition period were revolutionary in their implications. Early humans were beginning to modify their environments deliberately and systematically, rather than simply adapting to existing conditions. They were clearing forests, diverting water, and managing plant and animal populations in ways that created more productive and predictable resource bases. The technological innovations that emerged during this period built on Ice Age foundations, but expanded into entirely new areas. The same engineering principles that had been used to construct portable shelters were now being applied to permanent buildings. The understanding of materials and construction that had been developed for nomadic life was being used to create storage facilities, workshops, and community gathering spaces. The communication systems that had been essential for coordinating nomadic groups were being adapted for managing more complex settled communities. Instead of signaling across distances during migrations, people needed ways to coordinate activities within settlements, to maintain relationships with neighboring communities, and to organize the increasingly complex economic and social activities of settled life. The seasonal rhythms that had governed nomadic life were being replaced by more complex annual cycles that included not just hunting and migration, but planting, tending, harvesting, and storage activities. People were learning to think in longer timescales, planning not just for the next migration or hunting season, but for multiple years of cultivation and community development. The genetic advantages that had been selected for during the Ice Age were now being supplemented by cultural adaptations that were essential for success in settled communities. The physical endurance and cold tolerance that had been crucial for nomadic survival were being complemented by social skills, technological knowledge, and environmental management abilities that were essential for agricultural life. The psychological adaptations that had been necessary for nomadic life were being modified for the challenges of settled communities. The mental flexibility that had allowed people to adapt to constantly changing conditions during migrations was now being applied to the different but equally demanding challenges of managing complex settled societies. The regional variations that had developed during the Ice Age, as different groups adapted to different environmental conditions, were now leading to even greater diversity, as people in different areas developed specialized approaches to agriculture and settlement. Groups in river valleys developed different techniques than those in mountainous regions or coastal areas. The cultural innovations that emerged during this transition period reflected the fundamental changes in human lifestyle and social organization. New forms of art, music, and storytelling emerged that celebrated agricultural cycles, community life, and the human ability to shape and manage the environment. Religious and spiritual practices evolved to address the new relationships between humans and the landscapes they were transforming. The knowledge integration systems that developed during this period were more complex than anything that had existed during the Ice Age. People needed to combine traditional nomadic knowledge with new agricultural and settlement expertise, creating educational systems that preserved essential survival skills while adding new capabilities required for settled life. The long-term planning abilities that emerged during this period were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. Instead of planning for single migration cycles or hunting seasons, people were beginning to think in terms of generations. They were planting orchards that wouldn't produce fruit for years, constructing buildings that were designed to last for decades, and developing land management systems that required sustained effort over long periods. The social stratification that began to emerge during this period reflected the increasing complexity of settled communities. The relatively egalitarian social structures that had characterized nomadic groups were giving way to more hierarchical systems that recognized different types of expertise and contribution to community welfare. People who excelled at plant cultivation, animal management, or community organization began to hold different social positions than those whose skills were more suited to traditional hunting and nomadic life. The economic systems that developed during this transition were more complex than anything that had existed during the Ice Age. Instead of the relatively simple resource sharing that had characterized nomadic groups, settled communities needed systems for managing surpluses, organizing specialized production, and coordinating trade relationships with multiple other communities. The environmental impacts of this transition were beginning to be significant for the first time in human history. The land clearing, water diversion, and intensive resource management that characterized early agricultural communities were starting to modify local ecosystems in ways that would have lasting consequences. Humans were beginning to become a geological force, shaping landscapes and influencing environmental systems on scales that had never existed before. The population growth that resulted from more reliable food sources and settled lifestyles was creating new challenges and opportunities. Larger communities could support greater specialization and more complex social institutions, but they also required more sophisticated management systems and created new types of social tensions and conflicts. The technological acceleration that characterized this period was remarkable in its pace and scope. The innovations that had accumulated slowly over thousands of years of nomadic life were now being supplemented by rapid developments in agriculture, construction, crafts, and social organization. The rate of cultural and technological change was increasing exponentially. The exploration and expansion that had characterized the Ice Age were continuing but taking new forms. Instead of following animal migrations, people were now exploring new territories for their agricultural potential, seeking out regions that could support permanent settlements and intensive resource management. This exploration was leading to the discovery and settlement of previously uninhabited regions across the globe. The legacy systems that emerged during this period were designed to preserve and transmit not just survival knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom and cultural achievements of increasingly complex societies. The oral traditions that had been sufficient for nomadic groups were being supplemented by new forms of knowledge preservation that could handle the greater complexity and longer timescales of settled life. But perhaps most importantly, the transition from Ice Age survival to post-glacial settlement represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and their environment. Instead of adapting to existing conditions, people were beginning to modify those conditions to suit their needs. This represented a new phase in human evolution, one that would lead to agriculture, civilization, and ultimately to the modern world. The story of this transition is ultimately about human adaptability and innovation in the face of fundamental change. The same qualities that had allowed our ancestors to survive the harshest conditions in Earth's recent history now enabled them to envision and create entirely new ways of living. The cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and technological innovation that had been honed during the Ice Age became the foundation for human expansion and development in the post-glacial world. As we'll explore in the final part of our journey through Ice Age survival, the skills and knowledge that early humans developed during this challenging period didn't just help them survive the cold and find food. They created capabilities that would allow humanity to spread across the entire planet, to develop complex civilizations, and ultimately to reshape the world itself. The end of the Ice Age wasn't just the end of a climatic period. It was the beginning of a new chapter in human history, one that would be characterized by growth, expansion, and innovation on scales that would have been unimaginable to our nomadic ancestors. But all of it built on the foundation of survival skills, social cooperation, and adaptive thinking that had been forged in the crucible of Ice Age survival. The legacy of those harsh millennia lives on in every aspect of human civilization today. The cooperation that was essential for mammoth hunts became the foundation for modern teamwork and social organization. The innovation that was necessary for surviving in impossible conditions became the driving force behind technological advancement. The adaptability that allowed our ancestors to thrive in changing environments became the key to human success in every subsequent challenge we faced. The innovations and adaptations that allowed our ancestors to survive the Ice Age created something far more valuable than just temporary solutions to harsh conditions. They forged the fundamental characteristics that would define humanity for all the millennia that followed. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire story is how these survival strategies didn't just help people endure the cold. They actually rewired human evolution itself. Consider the brain development that occurred during this period. The constant problem-solving required for Ice Age survival, the need to remember complex seasonal patterns, the coordination required for group hunts, all of this pushed human cognitive capabilities to entirely new levels. Archaeological evidence suggests that brain size increased significantly during this period. But more importantly, the complexity of human thinking expanded in ways that would have lasting consequences. The memory systems that early humans developed weren't just about remembering where to find food or how to make tools. They were about creating mental libraries of environmental knowledge that could span decades or even generations. Elders who could recall weather patterns from 40 years earlier, who remembered the locations of resources that might only be available during rare climatic conditions, became living encyclopedias of survival information. This emphasis on memory and knowledge preservation drove the development of increasingly sophisticated forms of communication. The simple gestures and basic vocalizations that might have sufficed for earlier human societies were completely inadequate for transmitting the complex technical and environmental knowledge that Ice Age survival required. Language had to evolve rapidly to handle concepts like seasonal timing, multi-step tool construction processes, and coordinate hunting strategies. But the most profound changes weren't just cognitive, they were social and emotional. The level of cooperation required for Ice Age survival created humans who were fundamentally different from their ancestors in their capacity for empathy, trust, and collective action. When your survival literally depends on the reliability and competence of the people around you, natural selection favors individuals who can form strong social bonds and work effectively as part of a group. The stress management systems that developed during this period were equally important. Living under constant threat never knowing when the next meal might come, dealing with the deaths of group members from cold, starvation, or hunting accidents. All of this created psychological pressures that could have destroyed early human societies. Instead, our ancestors developed cultural technologies for managing trauma, maintaining hope, and preserving group morale even during the darkest periods. The rituals and ceremonies that emerged during the Ice Age weren't just primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated psychological tools designed to help people cope with uncertainty, process grief and loss, and maintain the social bonds that were essential for survival. The cave paintings that we find from this period aren't just artistic expressions. They're evidence of humans developing symbolic thinking, creating shared meanings that helped groups maintain their identity and purpose across generations. The decision-making processes that evolved during this period were remarkably sophisticated. Groups had to make choices about resource allocation, territorial movements, and risk management that required balancing immediate needs against long-term survival. These weren't simple decisions that could be made by individual leaders. They required consultation, debate, and consensus building that took into account multiple perspectives and areas of expertise. The leadership structures that emerged were fluid and adaptive, recognizing that different situations required different types of expertise. The person who was best at predicting weather patterns might lead decisions about when to travel. The most skilled hunter might guide strategies for taking down large game. The individual with the best knowledge of plant resources might direct foraging activities. This flexible approach to authority created more effective decision-making than rigid hierarchies could have provided. The conflict resolution mechanisms that developed during this period had to be incredibly effective, because groups simply couldn't afford to have internal disputes escalate into violence or permanent divisions. Early humans developed sophisticated methods for mediating disagreements, restoring relationships, and maintaining group harmony even after serious conflicts. These social technologies became the foundation for more complex forms of governance and law that would emerge in later societies. The child development practices of Ice Age communities were designed to produce adults who could function effectively under extreme stress. Children weren't just protected and cared for. They were systematically trained in the physical, cognitive, and social skills that would be essential for their survival. This education began in infancy and continued throughout childhood, creating individuals who were far more capable and resilient than children in less challenging environments. The gender roles that emerged during this period were based on practical considerations rather than abstract social conventions. Everyone, regardless of gender, had to contribute essential skills to group survival. Women and men developed different specializations based on physical capabilities and social needs, but both were recognized as crucial contributors to the community's welfare. This practical egalitarianism created social structures that were more flexible and adaptive than rigid gender hierarchies. The healthcare systems that developed during the Ice Age were remarkably sophisticated given the limited resources available. Early humans learned to treat injuries, manage illnesses, and provide care for disabled group members using plant medicines, physical therapy techniques, and social support systems. The fact that archaeological sites show evidence of individuals surviving severe injuries and disabilities demonstrates that Ice Age communities were committed to caring for all their members. The environmental management practices that emerged during this period represented the beginning of human influence on natural systems. Early humans learned to use fire to manage landscapes, encouraging the growth of plants they needed and creating more favorable conditions for the animals they hunted. This wasn't just adaptation to existing conditions. It was the beginning of active environmental modification that would eventually lead to agriculture and civilization. The migration patterns that developed during the Ice Age weren't just responses to changing conditions. They were strategic expansions that allowed humans to explore and occupy new territories. The same survival skills that had been developed for enduring harsh conditions enabled groups to push into previously uninhabitable regions, eventually spreading across every continent except Antarctica. The technological innovations that emerged during this period weren't just tools for immediate survival. They were platforms for future development. The understanding of materials, construction principles, and engineering concepts that was developed for Ice Age survival became the foundation for all subsequent technological advancement. The same cognitive processes that allowed early humans to design effective hunting weapons would eventually be applied to agriculture, architecture, and industry. The trade networks that began during the Ice Age represented the first steps toward global economic systems. The exchange of materials, tools, and knowledge between distant groups created interconnections that spanned vast territories. These networks weren't just about obtaining scarce resources. They were about sharing innovations and maintaining cultural connections that prevented isolated groups from losing essential knowledge. The artistic traditions that emerged during this period weren't just decorative activities. They were sophisticated communication technologies that allowed groups to preserve and transmit complex information across generations. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and decorated tools all served as forms of information storage that supplemented oral traditions and helped maintain cultural continuity. The spiritual beliefs and practices that developed during the Ice Age served crucial psychological and social functions. They provided frameworks for understanding and coping with the uncertainties of survival, created shared identities that bound groups together, and offered comfort during periods of loss and hardship. These belief systems weren't obstacles to rational thinking. They were psychological technologies that enabled people to function effectively under conditions that would have been overwhelming without some form of meaning-making system. The seasonal rhythms that governed Ice Age life created patterns of activity and rest that were perfectly adapted to the demands of survival in harsh environments. These rhythms weren't just practical schedules. They were deeply embedded cultural patterns that influenced everything from social gatherings to spiritual practices. The ability to live in harmony with natural cycles became a fundamental aspect of human psychology that persists even in modern urban environments. The resource management systems that developed during this period were incredibly sophisticated in their efficiency and sustainability. Early humans learned to use every part of the animals they killed to harvest plants in ways that didn't destroy future productivity and to manage territories in ways that maintained their long-term viability. These practices represented some of the earliest examples of sustainable resource use in human history. The emergency response systems that Ice Age communities developed were designed to handle the life-threatening crises that were a constant part of their existence. Groups had predetermined procedures for dealing with injuries, severe weather, food shortages, and other emergencies that could threaten the survival of the entire community. These systems required advanced planning, resource allocation, and role assignment that demonstrated remarkable organizational capabilities. The knowledge transmission systems that emerged during this period were designed to ensure that crucial survival information was preserved and passed down accurately across generations. This wasn't just informal learning through observation and practice. It was systematic education that included formal instruction, testing, and certification processes to ensure that essential skills were maintained at adequate levels within the community. The innovation processes that characterized Ice Age survival weren't just random trial and error. They were systematic approaches to problem solving that included experimentation, evaluation, and refinement of new techniques and technologies. The rapid pace of innovation during this period suggests that early humans had developed effective methods for identifying problems, generating solutions, and implementing improvements. The alliance-building capabilities that emerged during this period enabled groups to form cooperative relationships with other communities for mutual benefit. These alliances weren't just temporary arrangements for specific purposes. They were long-term partnerships that included mutual defense agreements, resource sharing arrangements, and knowledge exchange systems that benefited all participating groups. The legacy of Ice Age survival extends far beyond the specific techniques and technologies that were developed during this period. It includes the fundamental human characteristics that made all subsequent achievements possible. The cooperation, innovation, adaptability, and resilience that were forged during the Ice Age became permanent parts of human nature that would drive progress and development for thousands of years to come. The genetic changes that occurred during this period weren't just adaptations to cold weather. They included modifications to brain structure and function that enhanced cognitive capabilities, changes to social behavior systems that improved group cooperation, and alterations to stress response mechanisms that allowed people to function effectively under pressure. These genetic changes became permanent parts of human biology that continue to influence behavior and capabilities today. The cultural evolution that occurred during the Ice Age was as significant as the biological evolution that accompanied it. The development of language, art, religion, and social institutions during this period created the foundation for all subsequent human cultural achievement. The symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, and creative expression that emerged during the Ice Age became defining characteristics of human consciousness. The psychological resilience that was developed during this period created humans who were capable of enduring hardship, adapting to change, and maintaining hope even in the most challenging circumstances. This resilience wasn't just individual strength. It was a collective capability that allowed entire communities to survive and thrive under conditions that would have destroyed less cohesive groups. The environmental awareness that developed during the Ice Age created humans who understood their dependence on natural systems and their ability to influence those systems through their actions. This awareness included both practical knowledge about resource management and deeper understanding about the interconnectedness of all living things. These insights would eventually lead to more sophisticated forms of environmental stewardship and conservation. The global perspective that emerged from Ice Age migrations created humans who understood that the world was vast and diverse, that different environments required different strategies, and that cooperation with distant groups could provide benefits that isolation could not. This global awareness became the foundation for trade, exploration, and cultural exchange that would eventually connect all human societies. The time management capabilities that were essential for Ice Age survival created humans who could think and plan across multiple timescales simultaneously. The ability to balance immediate needs against long-term objectives, to prepare for seasonal changes while responding to daily challenges, became fundamental aspects of human cognition that would prove essential for agriculture, civilization, and technological development. The quality control systems that emerged during this period ensured that tools, techniques, and social practices met the high standards required for survival in harsh conditions. This emphasis on excellence and reliability became a permanent part of human culture that would drive continuous improvement and innovation in all areas of human activity. The story of Ice Age survival is ultimately the story of human potential being realized under the most challenging possible conditions. It demonstrates that when faced with seemingly impossible obstacles, humans don't just endure, they innovate, they cooperate, they adapt, and they emerge stronger than they were before. The legacy of that achievement lives on in every aspect of human civilization, from the technologies we use to the social institutions that govern our lives, to the creative expressions that define our cultures. The humans who survived the Ice Age weren't just our ancestors. They were the creators of human civilization itself, the inventors of the capabilities and characteristics that would allow their descendants to spread across the planet, to build complex societies, and ultimately to reach for the stars. Their story isn't just about survival, it's about the triumph of human ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience in the face of the ultimate test. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Ice Age survival isn't found in our technologies or social structures. It's written into our very DNA, encoded in genetic sequences that still influence how we think, how we cooperate, and how we respond to challenges today. The humans who emerged from the Ice Age weren't just survivors, they were evolutionarily transformed beings whose capabilities had been forged in the crucible of impossible conditions. Consider what happened to human genetics during this period. The constant selection pressure of extreme survival challenges didn't just favor the physically strongest or the most individually capable. It favored those who could work together most effectively, who could innovate under pressure, who could maintain psychological stability during prolonged stress. These weren't just behavioral adaptations that could be learned and forgotten. They became embedded in our genetic code. The brain development that occurred during the Ice Age created cognitive architectures that are still shaping human behavior 20,000 years later. The neural pathways that were strengthened by constant problem solving, by the need to track complex environmental patterns, by the demands of coordinating group activities, became permanent features of human consciousness. We still carry the mental hardware that was optimized for Ice Age survival. The social bonding mechanisms that were essential for group survival during the Ice Age created humans who are fundamentally wired for cooperation in ways that distinguish us from every other species on Earth. The capacity for trust, for reciprocity, for collective action that transcends individual self-interest. These aren't just cultural values we've developed. They're biological imperatives that were burned into our genetic structure during the harshest period in recent human history. The stress response systems that allowed our ancestors to function effectively under constant threat created psychological resilience mechanisms that continue to serve us today. The ability to maintain focus during crises, to make rational decisions under pressure, to recover from trauma and setbacks, these capabilities were literally selected for during thousands of years of survival challenges that would have broken less resilient individuals. The memory systems that were essential for preserving crucial survival knowledge created cognitive capabilities that far exceed what most modern humans ever use. Our ancestors had to maintain vast mental databases of environmental information, seasonal patterns, technical knowledge, and social relationships without any external storage systems. The memory palaces they built in their minds were architectural marvels of information organization that we're only beginning to understand. The story of Ice Age survival isn't just ancient history, it's the blueprint for everything that makes us human today. Every time you work together on a difficult project, every time you adapt to unexpected challenges, every time you innovate under pressure, you're using capabilities that were forged in the frozen landscapes of 20,000 years ago. Our ancestors didn't just survive the harshest conditions in Earth's recent history. They transformed themselves into something entirely new, creating the foundation for every human achievement that followed. Their legacy lives on in our DNA, in our social structures, in our unstoppable drive to explore, adapt, and thrive, no matter what obstacles we face. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through time. If this story of human resilience amazed you as much as it amazes me, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into our remarkable past, and let me know in the comments what aspect of Ice Age survival impressed you most. Until next time, remember that you carry the genes of the ultimate survivors.